Five Country close-up year ender 2820.
Turn on Five Country close-up on 5 TV.
Good evening and welcome to the 1980s.
I'm Bob Pyle.
I'm Michael Mahoney.
I'm Deborah Cutter.
I'm Twyla Young. We're here in the atrium of the Design Center at Iowa State University. It's a brand new building, a look at the future. But tonight we're going to take one last look backwards at the 1970s and what they did for and to Iowans. We'll be looking at Iowa's main industry, agriculture.
We'll look back at what's happened to the ways we buy and use energy.
We'll look at how our lifestyles have changed, what's new and different about the way we spend our leisure time.
And we'll look at what happened inside our pocketbooks.
Money makes the world go around, the world go around, the world. Money makes the world go around.
In 1970, everybody's gotten, new clothes, cars. They had nice cars, and today nobody can afford to even hardly buy anything, let alone live.
Food prices has gone up, taxes has gone up, interest on loans has gone up, double what it was 10 years ago or more.
We haven't given up too much, but it'll soon put the squeeze on.
I don't know if there's anything that we can do about it, but every week I come to the store, things have gone higher and higher, and sometimes you can't hardly believe it.
Skyrocketing prices is what a lot of us will remember in the 70s. The cost of basics like food more than doubled. Staples like sugar and meat led the way. Milk, coffee, and others also showed steep increases. Chocolate chips, for example, were about 50 cents for a 12-ounce package 10 years ago. Today, they're almost $2 a package. In fact, overall inflation jumped from about 5.5% in 1970 to over 13% in 1979. Who would have guessed that milk in Iowa would have jumped from about 50 cents a half gallon in 1970 to over 90 cents by 1980? The cost of retail goods also increased. In fact, overall consumer prices for Iowa and every other state jumped 101% in the last decade. As prices rose, more consumers began to rely more heavily on credit, so much so that overall consumer debt in this country nearly tripled from $117 billion in 1969 to nearly $304 billion by 1979. By the end of the decade, one of every $4 of most Iowans' take-home pay went to pay debts. There were signs, however, by the late 1970s that Iowans and most Americans were starting to tighten their belts. In October 1979, overall retail sales dipped by nearly 2%, the sharpest drop in 4.5 years. Retail store manager Dennis Julius also noticed the change in consumer buying habits.
People seem to shop ads a lot more fluently than they have before. They're more conscientious of a good value, and they use coupons quite a bit more extensively than they used to in the past.
Are they more careful about what they buy and prices?
Yes, because of the high inflation, I think people really do watch their budget and what they spend a lot more closely now.
Probably nowhere was the crimp of high prices felt more than at the gas pump. In 1970, the price of a gallon of gas in Iowa was about 30 cents. Today, Iowans pay $1 or more a gallon. But the cost of food and gas was not the only thing on the rise in the past decade. Housing was on the upswing in the 70s. Investing in a home became more important to both the single and family dweller. Housing starts in Iowa increased steadily through most of the 70s. It wasn't until 1978, when the government took steps to cut inflation by pressuring for high interest rates, that housing starts began to taper off. Interest rates on home loans surged from 5% in 1970 to over 15% in 1979, and that was bound to have an effect on Iowa's housing market. Interest rates, growing inflation, and the high cost of heating a home caused many housing payments on new homes to triple by the end of the decade. Doug Getter of the Iowa Development Commission says these factors changed Iowa's housing market.
There's been a definite trend toward single-family households, a movement away from renting property. Also, we have a great deal of interest in apartment living. Condominiums have taken on a bigger role than what they even were considered back 10 years ago. in the final analysis, a household is considered to be an investment. And I think the big difference between 1979 and 1969 is that very issue, because people want something for the dollar that they're spending.
The 70s in Iowa also saw more and more women entering the workforce. In fact, women today in Iowa comprise nearly half of the working population. Back in 1970, about 400,000 Iowa women worked. That number grew steadily through the decade to nearly 600,000 by last year. Judy Erickson of Job Service of Iowa says more women in the workforce had an effect on per capita income in the state.
Basically, we've seen quite a big change in per capita income. It's almost doubled over the decade. Part of this is obviously due to inflation. People want more money because prices for everything are higher, and just general economic growth in the economy.
Overall employment in Iowa grew steadily in the 70s. Economist Dr. Marvin Julius of Iowa State University says there were several reasons.
Employment in Iowa has increased significantly between 1970 and by the end of the decade, as we're projecting, perhaps almost 25%. The major factor behind that is probably our industrialization, increases in industries other than agriculture, which then allow others to increase in a sort of a multiplier effect. Manufacturing, I said, is a leading one, starting this, perhaps the insurance industry. Along with that then comes these industries that serve the local population, such as retail trade, where we've had a significant increase also, partly because of increase of employment generally, and also because people have more income than before.
A lot of things happened in Iowa's economy in the past decade. Employment and wages surged, yet Iowans were still forced to tighten their belts to cope with inflationary costs of essentials like food and gas. More people started to invest, hoping to get a better return on their dollar. It was a time of financial change and adjustment. In fact, the high cost of everything was and probably always will be the most talked about topic of the 70s.
In the 70s, what I can remember most is, before hardly spending any money for Christmas presents. And now, like I was spending $2 or $3 a present. Now I was spending like $5 to $8 a present.
I think it's just the way the times are changing. Everything has gone up. It isn't only groceries, it's everything else.
The speed limit changed in the 70s, and we've got prices of oil and gasoline going up, so it limits what you do and everything.
I went on retirement in 1970, and I got $350 a month then, and now I get $635, and I can't buy as much now as I could then.
Our income's nearly doubled in the last 7 or 8 years, and I think we have no more to show for it now than we did a few years ago.
The decade of the 70s, all I can say is that the cost of living really has gone up.
Oh, money, 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 money. Get a little money, 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 money. But the yellow bucks go round. That clinking, clanking, clunking sound is all that makes the world go round. It makes the world go round.
Not only have there been changes in the economy, there also has been many changes in lifestyles. They weren't as dramatic as in the 1960s, but just as important. In Iowa, we saw dramatic changes in people's lifestyles. This was the decade of divorce and the rise of singles. This was also the decade of changing roles for both men and women. And during the last 10 years, we also took a turn in how we spend our free time.
But the words we're hiding from him now tear the heart right out of me. Our D-I-V-O-R-C-E becomes final today.
Divorce has risen dramatically during the past decade, especially in Iowa. Recent figures show that almost 2 out of every 3 Iowans who get married wind up in divorce proceedings.
Well, there's no question that over the last 5 years, if not the last decade, there's been a substantial increase in the number of dissolutions, we call them now, that have gone through this court that I've been aware of either as a practicing attorney or the past 6.5 years as a district court judge.
The 70s have brought divorce out of the closet, so to speak. It's something that's talked about nowadays in places other than courtrooms.
Well, I've learned that I love my little boy, and that I'm capable of taking care of him.
What do you mean?
I want my son.
You can't have him.
In the past several years, divorce has found its way as a common subject on the silver screen. In movies such as Starting Over and Kramer vs. Kramer, different aspects of divorce are examined closely.
Are you and Mom ever going to get remarried?
No, Mommy and me will never be remarried.
I bet if she saw this, she'd remarry you.
I sense it more perhaps with the women that they are becoming more independent, and I'm not saying that's wrong, but it's fact.
I've got to be me without you. That line seems to fit well with the 1970s. The couple has taken the back seat to the individual. Not in all cases, mind you, but many young people are questioning the whole marriage scene.
Definitely apprehensive. Maybe in about 8 years. I'm 21 now, and my goals are about 30.
I think it is for me sometime in the near future, but first I need to designate a career and to find myself. I think each individual needs to be their own person first before uniting with someone else.
Bob, what I feel about marriage is that it is something that a person, especially of the 70s, should hold off on until one feels their career, their life, and basically all of their personality changes are settled in and you feel secure with yourself as a person. So I feel I will probably hold off until my mid or late 20s.
I'd like to settle down more, you know. I'm 21 also. I feel in about 6 years that maybe I'm ready after I got a, real good job and establish a little money.
With divorce on the upswing, many people are looking to alternatives to marriage. One is living together.
Oh, absolutely. I think that we have seen a lot of that in the 70s. Anything from just living together to, now the popular marriage contract that more and more people are doing, kind of writing down everything you own and everything I own. And if this marriage should break up, you're going to get back what you brought in, I'm going to get back what I brought in. Certainly things like, what went on in the Lee Marvin case, I think really relate. People see that on TV and they think, if this is going to happen, I'm not sure, maybe how are we going to handle this? So, yeah, I would say that definitely different kinds of things. Living together, living perhaps in a communal situation with 3 couples. The 70s was kind of a time to find out how it could work out.
I am woman, hear me roar, in numbers too big to ignore. And I know too much to go back and pretend. 'Cause I've heard it all before, and I've been down there on the floor. No one's ever gonna keep me down again.
The past 10 years have also brought us a surge in the women's movement, and it has touched virtually every aspect of American life. Graduate schools across the country got a sudden increase in women heading for professions, and by the mid-70s, women took over 25% of management-level jobs.
I am strong. I am invincible. I am woman.
Well, I think there was a lot of change, but we haven't gone far enough, I guess.
Okay, where do you think it's going to go?
Well, I hope it's going to go to at least the passage of the ERA, and getting women more involved in maybe the corporate structure and higher up the corporate ladder, women more involved and in different positions of power.
So I think that now we have many more women actually involved in the women's movement and believing in feminism and women's equality and women's rights. But we found that it's not necessarily going to work if we're nasty and hate men and yell and scream. What's going to work is if we try and work within the system. I think there's many more of us holding that kind of an attitude now.
While women were working to raise their status on the American scene, it seemed as though the nation as a whole was working on becoming physically fit.
Well, I think we've seen some exciting changes, and I think one of the greatest changes of all is the number of people that are out doing things, doing physical exercise, participating in sports, and not being a spectator. I think that's one of the greatest differences that we've seen in the 70s.
The physical fitness move was one good example of how America in the 1970s attempted to make itself better. As for the 1980s, well, the best we can do is try and hope for the best.
While Iowans were changing the way they live and view themselves, the main staple of Iowa's economy and society, the family farm, remained pretty much the same. 1/4 of all the top quality farmland in the world is in the state of Iowa, and almost all of it is owned by family farmers. But some things about those farms have changed in the last 10 years. In 1970, the average-sized farm in this state had 237 acres. In 1979, the average farm was 281 acres. That increase, which is tied to a decline in the number of farms, was small compared to some of the more dramatic changes in farming during the 70s. In 1971, Denny Flickinger started buying land in Story County, and he paid a little over $500 an acre for it. In the last 9 years, this land hasn't changed much, but the value of it certainly has. The land you own right now, if you were to sell it this year, what would you ask for it?
I would probably stay with market, basically in the area. Most of the tillable land in this area is starting at around $3,200 down to $2,800.
A minute ago, you started to say something about if a person had known 10 years ago what was going to happen. If you had known 10 years ago what was going to happen during this 10 years, what would you have done?
I'd owned a lot more land. I'd have mortgaged everything I could to try to get a hold of as many acres as I could possibly swing payments on, where now it's practically impossible. I just feel very fortunate I got what I got.
While land prices increased by 4, 5, sometimes 6 times over the course of the 70s, commodity prices fluctuated wildly. Corn started the decade at about $1 a bushel, dropped to a low of 94 cents in the fall of '71, and jumped to a decade high of more than $4 in '74. Soybeans saw an even more dramatic decade. From a low of $2.31 in '71, this miracle crop with an ever-expanding variety of uses jumped to a decade high of nearly $13 per bushel. The problem, at the close of the decade, corn was worth a little more than $2 a bushel, soybeans little more than $6. Economist Gene Futrell says that the increased value of land and the volatility of commodity prices have changed the face of Iowa farming. In this decade, agriculture in this state became more than ever remarkably lucrative for a few and a dangerous game for many.
One result of this, it seems to me, has been a situation that is very uneven, very mixed. I think we've seen some farms that have probably improved greatly their financial condition over this period, but we've also seen others who probably have experienced great difficulty. The capital requirements of farming are very high, the operating costs, family living expenses are very high, and so particularly for the young or the beginning farmer or a farmer who does not have a large resource base, he may have experienced real difficulty. On the other hand, the established farmer with, say, a good asset base, particularly in land that was purchased in earlier years, has probably done very well and has probably improved substantially his financial position.
One of the most important changes of the decade for Iowa agriculture came in 1972 from halfway across the world. The crops failed in the Soviet Union and opened up what was to become an ever-growing international market for Iowa grain.
One of the big developments I think that's been very important in this same area is just the general opening of trade with communist countries, not only Russia, but also with Eastern Europe and more recently now with mainland China. So this has been a big source of new markets for our farm products and probably markets that will continue to be there.
This decade has not only seen a dramatic change in the value of the land and the distribution of its products, it has seen the beginning of a growing consciousness that the land can be destroyed and lost forever unless steps are taken to conserve it. In 1970, virtually all of Iowa's 22 million acres of cultivated land was tilled with conventional plowing and planting techniques, the symbol of which has been the moldboard plow. By the close of the decade, on 10 million acres, nearly half of the state's farmland, the moldboard plow is no longer used. In its place have come a variety of techniques, implements, systems, and plans, which, lumped together, have come to be called conservation tillage.
We don't see this acceptance of the conservation tillage concept and the reduction in the number of tillage operations that farmers do slowing down. We think this will increase for several reasons. One, particularly the cost of fuel. And farmers are becoming very, very much conscious of this fuel cost in relation to their production costs. One of them has been the environmental concept, the consciousness of contaminating our environment. And in Iowa, our greatest water contaminant is silt. That's soil that runs off from our agricultural land. And so farmers became more and more conscious of this, and so they were more willing to accept some kind of a different practice to reduce this erosion that they were getting that, in essence, was also causing the pollution of our streams.
The backbone of Iowa's agriculture has always been the family farm. During this decade, farms owned and operated by a family, sometimes of more than one generation, have come under increasing pressure to succumb to corporate, sometimes foreign ownership. There have been a number of plans proposed to stem this trend, but perhaps the most dramatic support for the family farm as an economic unit and as a way of life came last fall from an unexpected source.
Here, in the heartland of America, the valleys and hills have been blanketed with grain. The herds and the flocks have multiplied many times over. By hard work, you have become masters of the earth, and you have subdued it.
Now, we did give him considerable information, and it really did come out exactly like we wanted it. It was just an excellent homily, and he said such beautiful things about farmers, about farming, the importance of the land. All of the things were said so well.
I guess it's partly pride in what you do, and you strive to try to accomplish something, and it's personal satisfaction, and the idea of being able to work your own property and do pretty much as you see fit with it to try to make a living makes you very pleased. And without that, what have you got?
For farm families and for urban families, for all Iowans, one inescapable change that the 70s wrought was in our access to energy for our homes, our vehicles, and our businesses.
At the start of the 70s, you could buy a gallon of gasoline for about the price of a pack of cigarettes, 35 to 40 cents. Now you can't afford the gas, and you don't dare smoke. This decade has seen some big changes in the way we think about and use the resources around us. Of course, the most notable change is the price and availability of fuel, not just gasoline. People have come to expect higher-priced gasoline, and they may even be resigned to a constant set of price increases. It's forcing some very harsh adjustments on how people spend their money and use their fuel. The oil situation has changed the entire auto industry in the country. Big cars were replaced by intermediate cars, and eventually the little compacts we used to laugh at are now becoming the rule rather than the exception. In fact, the whole idea the car is an extension of one's personality is in danger. People, unless they're very well off, usually can't live in and around their cars as they used to. Joyriding is out for many people, and the simple spin around the block is measured in cents now, rather than in manners. If there's a positive aspect to all these troubles, however, it may be that the country is finally making a true assessment of its transportation needs. Mass transit in our cities is now finally getting some of the attention it's asked for years. And one direct result of the latest gasoline squeeze is an increase in the daily ridership of buses on the MTA and in cities throughout the country. Another offshoot is the fact that the railroads, many broke and on the ropes, are now either being revitalized or restructured. And although it's not likely we'll ever see a return to the heyday of the passenger train, the rails, as a source to move freight from the field to the market, are now getting a more serious look. In fact, the redesign of the Rock Island and Milwaukee roads in Iowa are evidence that the rails are again being considered as a vital link in the country's transportation network. And the sad thing is that the railroad's potential has always been there. It took a national fuel crisis, however, to recognize it. And there's one other area where the changes in how we live are most evident. At the start of this decade, power companies were promoting all-electric homes. And while it was a great idea while it lasted, now those companies and the homes that they encouraged are scrambling to make sure they can be fueled. So in response to the ever-increasing cost to heat a home, people are coming up with all sorts of alternatives. Homes heated from the sun, homes heated from the earth, even cars run by corn. So clearly, the energy shortage, as we like to call it, is challenging our lifestyle and our ability to continue to grow. So far, people have been able to handle it. They don't like it, but they can handle it. And that's the challenge of the 80s. Can we continue to live the way we want, despite the problems with fuel? Or, more realistically, can we learn to adapt to the changes because we really don't have any other choice? Well, those are a few of the things that happened during the 70s and a few thoughts on what might happen in the 80s.
Obviously, a lot more happened than we had time to talk about, and we may well have left out what you thought was most important.
Speaking of what's most important, Bob, what will you remember most about this decade?
Well, the thing I think I'll remember most about the 1970s is a changing role for both men and women. The ability for both to play out each other's roles without fear of ridicule or embarrassment.
I think the 70s will mean people starting to define themselves, finding out who they really are.
You know, the thing I'll remember about the 70s is we finally put an end to the 60s. People stopped worrying about causes and started worrying about people.
For me, this last decade has meant a time when we became so much more aware of what a world community we live in and how really close the rest of the world is to us. I'll also remember how fast the last 10 years went. We'll be back in 2 weeks on 5 Country Close-Up, so be sure to join us January 15. For Bob, Deborah, Michael, and myself, good night and Happy New Year.